Hi, it's good to be here. So I'm from Just Kai, and we are a group of friends who don't want to buy food produced by slave labour. And I'm here in particular to ask the businesses represented here to help me with that. But I'd also like to share a few thoughts at the end for all of us on how to identify slave-free food. So for me, this all started in 2006. I was listening to the BBC and they had a report about the cocoa industry and how slavery and child labour were super common. That was a while back. Things have changed a bit since, but at least a fifth of all cocoa is still grown by children. And these are kids who are kept out of school to work. They often work 12-hour days, really dangerous conditions, often get beaten. So once I learnt that, I had to change what I bought. I didn't want to pay people to beat up kids. So we stopped buying chocolate and cocoa unless it was fair trade certified, which did limit our options back in 2006, but that seemed fine. These are luxury products. You don't need chocolate ice cream. And it didn't really feel right to have other people to suffer so I could have a treat. Fortunately, over the years, the range of fair trade products has increased considerably, and these days you can buy fair trade chocolate in any supermarket, and there's even fair trade chocolate ice cream and Easter eggs if you go looking. The next step came maybe 2 or 3 years ago. My mum, knowing I was interested in these things, wanted to know, what fish can I buy? She had been hearing stories about terrible abuses in the fishing industry. Slavery, rape, outright murder seemed remarkably common. And we found that even sticking to New Zealand caught fish didn't really help. There have been interviews of fishermen from boats working here, turning up just the same stories. In fact, just last year, in March, I think, a fishing company fishing here was prosecuted for not paying its workers at all for 2 years. So, what to do? Not hoping for much, I contacted the 2 companies whose products I myself bought most often, told them my concerns and said, I basically asked them, how can they tell me that these abuses aren't happening in their supply chains? And I was really surprised. Both of them, as it turned out, were conducting extensive audits. They had good reason to believe their supply chains were slave-free and working conditions were fine right throughout their supply chain. So encouraged by that, I started systematically contacting major brands available in New Zealand and asking them questions. It seems that some companies really are doing nothing, and others are just asking their suppliers to make promises, but a decent number are bringing in independent auditors to check what's going on deep into their supply chains. So I started this project hoping to find food that my mum and I could eat with a clear conscience. With some friends, I've started Just Kai so I could share what I've learned, partly because I believe many more consumers would care if they knew what was happening out of sight, and partly to help those who are already aware to identify brands they can trust. So, that's me. But what about you? I gather many of you here represent businesses, and you wouldn't be here if you didn't care about ethics. So what can you do to help me buy your products with confidence? So the first thing I want to say to you is this. If you haven't already, please add working conditions to your list of ethical concerns. The world seems to be full of dolphin-friendly fish companies and sustainable chocolate companies, which is good. Like, the environment really matters and sustainability is really important. But if you don't already, please consider worker welfare as well, because people matter too. When people talk about modern slavery, I mostly hear them talk about the sex industry. But the same numbers that Joanne was presenting earlier, the International Labour Organisation estimates that there are around 20 million people currently enslaved doing regular jobs. They're in fishing, farming, factory work. Some of them are like that girl Sophia doing domestic work. And there's about 5 million in sex work. So the bulk of the balance are people in forced marriage. So regular industries are actually a much bigger problem. So do you know if any of those 20 million people are working for your suppliers or the people who supply your suppliers? And if you already work towards good working conditions in your supply chain, there are 3 things you could do that would really help me to buy your products. Firstly, tell me what you're doing. I've been stunned to realise, like those fish companies, there's many companies out there doing sterling work in this space who just don't tell anyone. The other day I bought a bra from Icebreaker. I'd chosen them as they scored an A+ on Tearfun's Ethical Fashion Guide, which is a guide that ranks clothing brands according to working conditions. The box that came in said this. So it was natural, renewable, sustainable, comfortable. But it's also socially responsible. They audit the working conditions in all their factories that make their fabric and that make their finished products. But they're not telling me. It felt like such a lost opportunity. Telling that story alongside the environmental one is crucial if they want people like me to buy their stuff. I don't want to buy stuff made by slaves. If I don't know yours isn't, I'm not going to buy it. The second way you can help me buy your products is, if possible, get your claims certified. A reputable certification tells me straight away that I can trust what you're saying. If you don't have one, you're giving me a lot of work to do before I can buy your product. I need to think, do I trust that you know enough about the cocoa industry in Ivory Coast to ask the right questions of your suppliers? And do I think that you have the time and resources to look into that properly when you're already really busy running your business and making your products? If there's a certified option and an uncertified option, I'll just go for certified. It's just easier. So, what do I mean by reputable certification? So, first up, I want a certification with strong criteria for working conditions. Something like the Marine Stewardship Council, which you often see on fish, doesn't count in this space. It's good for environmental values. It's actually really hard to get, but it's weak on working conditions. They literally only check if you've been found guilty in an actual court of forced labour within the last 2 years. That's just not good enough. Following on from that, I want a certification that has teeth. I want a certification that uses unannounced third-party audits and penalises entities found to be substandard. Most large multinational companies already require all of their suppliers to promise not to use slave labour. But we still have 20 million slaves. Clearly, promises are not enough. Audits can still be faked, but they're the best tool we have, and much better than promises or checks by inexperienced people. And the final thing I look for is effectiveness. That mostly means that I favour large, well-established certifications. Their profile means I'm likely to hear about it if they aren't doing their job. So, these are some of the ones that I think are great. The two main fair trade certifications used in New Zealand, so there's the World Fair Trade Organisation that TradeAid uses, and then Fair Trade that's used much more widely, easily meet my criteria. The ones below also do, but you might not be familiar with them. So firstly, Fair Trade Sourced, this paler version of the Fair Trade logo. That's the single ingredient version of Fair Trade. For regular fair trade, if you make a multi-ingredient product, a certain percentage of those ingredients have to be fair trade certified, and anything that's available in a fair trade version has to be fair trade. Especially that first part isn't always feasible. You might make toiletries, for example, that just use a little bit of cocoa butter. And if that's the case for your products, you could look at the fair trade sourced ingredient mark instead, which will certify that all the cocoa in your product is fair trade. Then UTZ, this kind of reddish one here, is another single ingredient one. You can get it for tea, coffee, cocoa and hazelnuts. In terms of business, unlike fair trade, it doesn't require the farms to be co-ops, which makes it a good option if you work with a farm already that's structured as a regular business. For example, a few years back, Hague's, which are one of the big chocolate makers in Australia, helped the plantation that it had worked with for many years to transition to UTZ certification. And that means that they themselves can now be confident that working conditions are good on their plantation, and people like me can be confident as well because we see UTZ cocoa on all their products. So there's still some industries that don't have certifications, but if they do exist for yours, please see if you can use them. So, help me buy your products. Number 1, tell me what you're doing. Number 2, get your claims certified if you can. And number 3, dream big. Think of Ricky. Aim for the mass market. We need big dreams here because there's a huge problem, and a huge problem needs a huge solution. So it's been great to hear from Tim about marketing Scarborough Fair tea, and it's awesome that you can get fair trade tea in every supermarket now. Is that something that you could aspire to? With all the work I've been doing and the questions I've been asking, the thing that's excited me the most in this work are the achievements of Countdown, Sealord and Nestle, which is not your typical list of ethical companies. But they're all companies with surprising commitments to good working conditions, and their size means they're bringing better lives to thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So Countdown currently has all the factories producing their home brand goods independently audited for working conditions, and they're working at bringing those checks further into their supply chain. Sealord, similarly, only uses audited factories and even has audits on boats out at sea. And Nestle in Australia and New Zealand has external auditors checking working conditions on all the farms and factories that supply them with both fish and cocoa. And if the name Nestle triggers alarm bells about infant formula, you might be interested to know that they've changed their practices quite a lot there as well. Far from perfect, but a lot better than they used to be. So big players like these will probably never do as much for the welfare as their workers as small, dedicated players, like, for example, the Lucy Foundation, who's here, working with disabled people, making enormous differences in people's lives. But their scale means that they can make things a lot better for a lot of people. So what about you? Could your business reach the mass market one day? And whether you're a business or not, all of us here are consumers. So what can we, as consumers, do to make sure that we're not paying people to enslave other people? Remember, there's 20 million actual slaves out there, people working for no wages, unable to leave. Some of them are making stuff for us. So the goods bought in developed countries that are most likely to have slavery in their supply chains are, in order, computers and mobile phones, clothing, fish, cocoa and sugar. So, I'm from Just Kai, we focus on food. But I should quickly mention that Baptist World Aid in Australia have been making a big difference with the other two. They have an ethical electronics guide which covers lots of computer brands, and they've also teamed up with Tefund in New Zealand to make the ethical fashion guide, which you will have seen in your goodie bag when you arrived. So check out both of those before you next purchase electronics or clothing. But back to food: fish, cocoa, sugar. Slave-free cocoa is easy to identify, as there are reliable certifications that tell you it's slave-free right back to the farm. So there's the 2 Fair Trade certifications, the World Fair Trade Organisation that Trade Aid uses, the more standard fair trade. There's also UTZ, which I mentioned earlier. You see that on Milo and on Kit Kats. Also some Countdown things have it. It's a bit different from fair trade, and it doesn't pay a fair trade premium, but it still guarantees the workers are adults who are working freely, safe working conditions, maternity leave, living wage, all of that. I maintain a list of cocoa products that have these certifications, and you can get that from the Just Kai website, and check back from time to time. I update it from time to time. Sugar also is remarkably easy. So Trade Aid with the World Fair Trade Organisation has long sold fair trade sugar, and in the supermarket, Countdown has recently moved to Bon Sucro certification, this one at the bottom here, for all of their home brand sugar. That's a certification that's been around in Europe for quite a while. It's very similar to UTZ. Workers are free, adults, safe working conditions and so on, but again, no fair trade premium. So that's cocoa and sugar. But the highest risk food is fish. What can we do there? So fish is much harder. There's no certifications that the public can see, so it's much harder for us. It's also actually much harder for the companies. Fishing happens at sea, so it's hard to know what's going on. And it's a very high risk industry. Some boats are out for years, and if things go bad on that boat, you have just no options for getting away. Some fish, like salmon, which are caught inshore, are fairly safe, but tuna boats can be out at sea for 2 years with other boats coming in backwards and forwards to actually take the fish. And not only slavery, but also rape is very common on those boats, and murder is not unknown. And as I said at the beginning, buying New Zealand caught fish is no guarantee workers have been protected. That said, I've been pleasantly surprised to find a number of companies taking this stuff really seriously and bringing in third-party auditors deep into their supply chains. For tinned tuna, I'm only willing to buy from Sealord. They're the only company I found that does audits on boats in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And everything else from Sealord I would trust as well. But for fish other than tuna, there's other options you can also go for. We have buying guides on our website, and there's also hard copies on the Just Kai stand. One place fish crops up that you may not have thought of is pet food. Fish is very common in pet food and not always obvious. When you start reading ingredients lists, you'll find that it's in the majority of dry cat food and quite a lot of wet cat food, even if it says it's beef flavoured. Fish will be on the ingredients. It's also relatively common in dog food and almost universal in fish food. The fish that's used in pet food has often got really long supply chains, meaning it's very difficult even for the companies to know what's going on in their supply chain. And there are no mainstream brands, excuse me, which I'm confident are fully slave-free, but I have found a handful making pretty substantial efforts. And Purina, which has got a whole bunch of brands, is the real standout amongst those. They've got good checks on factories and are bringing more and more checks onto boats. So if you have a pet, check the ingredients in their current food. If you see any kind of fish, come and visit us at Just Kai. We have a buying guide for lower risk pet food. Hopefully your brand's already on there, but if it's not, you should be able to find something else similar enough that your pet will take to it. So slavery is a surprisingly big problem in the world today. Slave-produced products are hidden in the supply chains of many everyday things. And in summary to businesses, I'd like to say, please look for this in your supply chain, actively look. And if you are already looking, please tell me about it. Get your claims certified if you can, and aim for the big time. A big problem needs a big solution. And to everyone here, when you're shopping, remember that slave-produced products are hidden in amongst our ordinary groceries. Seek out reliably slave-free products, especially when you're buying fish, cocoa, and sugar. If we all do this, the economic model of these slaveholders will collapse, and those 20 million people will be set free. Thank you.
Questions for Heather? Anyone got a question for Heather? Yes.
I'd like to know if you
Going it the wrong way. Thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to know if you track humane treatment of poultry in supply chains, particularly in pet food.
No. I've decided to keep our focus quite tightly on simply human welfare issues. So there's a whole lot of other issues that are important, environmental issues, animal welfare issues, and so on are really important, but I've just decided to look into one thing, so that's not something I really know anything about.
Question up the back.
Thank you. Hey, I'm someone who has lactose intolerance, so I have to buy non-dairy milk. But I have heard that there are some things like, say, cashews, for example, the way that they're made causes massive acid-like burns on the arms of the people, you know, not good. Do you have options for people like me so we can make sure we're buying drinkable milk that's not, you know...
Yes, again, sorry, no. I have also heard that story, and I know the trade aid does cashew nuts themselves for that particular reason, but short of making your own out of cashew nuts from trade aid, I'm sorry, we've just the fish, cocoa and sugar.